They were auctioning my family's legacy while the dirt from my father's grave still clung to my shoes. My name is Jake Morrison. For 3 generations, my family has called the same stretch of Colorado foothills home. The Morrison Ranch, 12. 100 acres in my head, but on paper it was a neat 120 acres of pine and pasture, windmills and cedar fences, the kind of land you could follow by fingerprint. My grandfather bought this ground in 1958 after Korea, hauling timber, staking out fence lines, building the barns with hands that never really stopped working. He set the cedar posts so deep the winters couldn't move them and taught my father how to read clouds and rivers and the language of cattle. My father added the breeding stock, the combination of patience and stubbornness that turned a small operation into a working ranch that could pay the bills and teach a boy how to stand steady in the wind. When my father died earlier this month, I was the one left to manage what they built. The rhythms of ranch life are small rituals. Dawn checks on the herd, the metallic clink of a feed trough, the low hum of a windmill throwing water to the trough, the smell of hay warmed by the sun. Emma, my daughter at 16, learned those rhythms quicker than most. She could tack a horse and read a fence better than neighbors twice her age. This place wasn't an asset or a line on a map. It was identity. It was the sound of my grandfathers. Laughter over a cup of coffee and the smell of saddle leather in the afternoon. It was everything. 3 years ago, a subdivision crept up on our eastern border like mold on bread. Maplewood Heights arrived in a flurry of identical houses, mulched, lawns, and HOA brochures promising harmony. The lots were tidy, the streets named after trees, the promises glossy. The homeowners organized a board and elected Karen Whitfield as president, a woman who had done real estate development back in California and arrived with the manner of a person used to moving pieces on a map until they fit her plan. At first, Karen's demands were petty and precise. A new mailbox standard, one town over shuttered gifts of individuality, a paint color rule dictated uniformity, a directive on acceptable lawn green insisted the neighborhood appear deferentially manicured. It was annoyances and etiquette. At first, notices that slid under doors, polite sounding letters that suggested you might be out of step with your neighbors. Then the notices turned to photographs and invoices. Unsightly equipment storage, read one. Another complained about dust from our gravel road when summer turned the ground to powder. Then there were the letters. Not just warnings, but threats about fines, escalating tone, deadlines with teeth. It was like watching a slow machine learn to bite. Her obsession became our boundary fence. In her letters, she called it encroachment. 18 inches here, a supposed violation there. Always precise, always backed by a photograph. Except our deeds and grandfather's surveys told a different story. Those cedar posts had been set by hands that knew the land like a heartbeat. They were not an afterthought or a modern eyesore. They were markers of memory and utility. Neighbors began to look at me differently. In the feed store, eyes sharpened like knives. At the gas station, conversation thinned. A few folks who'd once been neighborly slid their carts away or avoided. At the handshake, the stage for conflict was set. I just didn't realize how far she'd be willing to push. I can still remember the first envelope that actually made my skin go cold. It was stamped and official, and it lied. It said I owed thousands in fines, that the HOA had initiated legal proceedings, that I'd been given notice and failed to respond. I crumpled the paper in my hand and assumed it was a mistake. Bureaucracy makes mistakes all the time. But a mistake becomes something else when a white Mercedes pulls into your driveway and a woman who makes her living building communities starts telling a different story about your home. This is where the story begins in earnest. A funeral, a long drive, a hand reaching for legal power, and a sign staked in my front yard that didn't belong there. The rest of it unfolded like bad weather. Fast once the first crack opened. The call came on a Tuesday morning that smelled like rain. My father had suffered a massive heart attack at his Montana place. I don't remember the details of packing. Grief is a kind of motion that makes everything else blur. I called in favors, arranged for our neighbor Bill Hendricks to watch the cattle. Bill, who'd been a county surveyor for 40 plus years and who knows this dirt like it was marked on his own palms, and left my daughter Emma with a friend. I drove with the highway stretching away under my headlights, the miles a slow blur of taillights. There were funeral details and a hollow inside me that 1,000 words couldn't fill. In that haze, I missed the first sign until Emma texted, Me, late Thursday evening. Dad, something's wrong at home. They're putting up signs. The words were small in my phone, but huge in my chest. I drove through the night. Dawn was a thin promise as I turned onto our gravel road. The crunch under my tires that used to be comfort felt like something monstrous. Then I saw it. An auction sign planted like a provocation in our front yard. Two men in suits with clipboards were making markings. A survey tripod stood like a cold instrument between the past and the present. Karen Whitfield's white Mercedes was parked by the barn, her silhouette immaculate and certain. Stepped out of my truck with the early air heavy in my lungs. The taller of the two men barely looked up as I approached. Their indifference was unpracticed. We're conducting a pre-auction assessment, he said, clinical and blunt. The phrase folded over me like a foreign language. Before I could reply, Karen appeared from behind the Mercedes as though she'd been appointed by fate to stand there. She didn't reach out in condolence. She looked at me with something like distaste. Efficient, practiced. She held her phone to her ear and told a 911 operator I was trespassing on their common area and causing a disturbance. Deputy Maria Santos pulled up 20 minutes later, dust trailing behind the cruiser, the kind of familiarity that comes from small towns. I knew Maria. Her daughter and Emma had ridden together in 4H. When she unfolded the thick folder Karen offered, her face shifted from casual to puzzled. $47,000, she read aloud from the document. The stack of papers was stamped with seals and signatures that looked official. It referenced constructive abandonment and automatic forfeiture under HOA covenants I never agreed to. It claimed certified letters had been returned unclaimed. Letters I'd never received. Deputy Santos looked up at me and said what she had to say. This is a civil matter. She couldn't arrest anyone for a boundary dispute, but the words that Maynard had already been spoken. The auction, according to the paper Karen waved like evidence, was scheduled for Saturday, 48 hours away. I stood on soil my grandfather irrigated with the Colorado River and watched strangers measure and mark and mutter. In those moments, you feel an old anger rise in you that is not about money or convenience. It's about being stolen from, about memory being taken apart by people who don't understand the weight of what they hold in their hands. 48 hours. That's all the time they gave me before they tried to sell my land. If you owned a multi-generation property, what would be the first thing you'd do to protect it? Share your top tip in the comments. I'll read them.